The following presentation is a gift from the team at Streamline Publishing, publishers of Fine Art Connoisseur, Plein Air Magazine, and weekly newsletters Fine Art Today, Realism Today, Plein Air Today, and American Watercolor, and events the Plein Air Convention and the Figurative Art Convention. We offer over 400 different art instruction tutorials and ultra high-quality video by the world's leading artists. If you like what you see, help us support our artists and our team with your purchase. Each video aired has a special discount code for today only in the comments section with a link to the video offered. And to see everything we do, or if you want to receive notice of new releases, new products, and new events for artists, simply click the other link, which says, "See everything we do." Thank you.
Hi, I'm Eric Rhodes, publisher of Fine Art Connoisseur and Plein Air Magazine. We're here every day at 3 o'clock, and today we have a free video sample for you called Inner Flame with William A. Schneider. Enjoy.
Before we get started, I want to talk a little bit about my palette. And you see that I have 4 trays here. These are set up. This tray is reds, oranges, and yellows, kind of my warm colors. And here is a box full of greens, and I'll talk about that again in a second. And then here I've got grays, blues, and purples, and then cream colored going into creamier, olivey greens, getting over to the brighter greens. And so it's a way to keep things organized. If you look in the red tray, you can see that I've got the darkest values up at the top. And as you move down further, they get lighter and lighter. Sort of my middle values, this is where I do most of my painting generally. There's kind of these middle ranges. For whatever reason, the pastel manufacturers, well, I know the reason. Pastels are made by manufacturers, not artists necessarily. And so they tend to give you way too many lights, and there's never enough deep darks. I have, just in my Rembrandt set alone, probably 10 lifetimes worth of highlight colors, which I will never ever be able to use up because there's just so many lights. Like I said, the middle range is what I generally use for most of the work, and then the deep darks are at the top. Once we get into the painting, it's sort of a truism that the deepest, darkest areas are generally warm colors. And so I'm always hunting for a deeper, warmer dark. And those are the ones that are hard to come by. So this is my warm tray. If I move over and start talking about some of the blues, this blue tray is laid out pretty much the same way as the reds and yellows. On the left side, I've got grays going into blues, and then on the far right, purple. It's really designed to just keep the different shades. In essence, I've squared out a color wheel. But, the darkest grays up at the top, getting lighter and lighter as you come down. Darkest blues up at the top, getting lighter and lighter as you come down. And the darkest purples at the top, getting lighter and lighter as you come down. And as you go further to the right, getting warmer and warmer. In reality, this should probably be right exactly next to my red tray if I was going to truly replicate the color wheel, but I think in terms of trays rather than a color wheel necessarily. This tray is my cream colors on the left, kind of a deep mustardy yellow, getting lighter as it moves down till you get all the way to white. And then olive greens moving down, and then bluer greens moving down. I guess this should be over here if I was to be consistent, and this should be over here. And when I work, I get disorganized. Down at the very front, you see a stump that's used for blending, and these are charcoal sticks that I use for some of my preliminary drawing, which you'll see once we get into it. Now, the next tray is the odd man out, and I'll talk about that. This tray, like I said, is kind of the odd man out. these should be intermingled with my greens and blues, but it's specific manufacturer, Terry Ludwig. I actually won this in a pastel competition, and I love these pastels. They're square, so they're easy to hold, and once I get into the piece, you'll see that I use the broad side of the pastels generally, kind of like a broad brush, and so these are easy to hang on to, and they are just buttery soft. These are softer even than Sennelier's. And maybe I should talk about the brands I use. My basic set is Rembrandt Reds, and those are kind of my bread and butter. The Rembrandt are a little bit harder than the other three brands I use, which are Sennelier, Unison, and then these Terry Ludwig. And I guess in order of hardness, it would be Rembrandt, followed by Unison, followed by Sennelier, and then the softest are the Ludwig. And all of them are really soft pastels. I do not use hard pastels. They don't work well with the blending technique that I use. But even within the range of soft pastels, there's different levels. And I think that's pretty much all I'd want to say about the palette. And you'll see how it gets used in the painting process. We're going to try something very interesting today. Interesting and challenging, so we'll see if we can pull this off. But we have Mike and Lupe in the dark, lit only by a kerosene lantern, and that's going to be the light source. And I'm actually going to paint the light source. Usually you don't have the light source in the picture plane, but today we're going to try it using the light source. That means I'm going to have to key everything else way down. And so we're going to be dealing with a very dark image except for the light. And so one of the first things I want to do is establish that light, because that's clearly going to be my lightest light, and everything else has to work in relationship to that. Let's get something down there. Now, one of the things that is going to make this challenging is that we're going to have the light source in the picture. Pastels, regardless of how fine they may be, are not light. So we have a very limited range. You know, if I hold this pastel up, and if I held it up in front of a candle, it would look like a dark object. This is not a light source. It just reflects light. And so what we have to do is get the relationships to give you the same relationships you see with a light source and then other objects in there. So that's going to be a bit more challenging than if you're just dealing all with reflected light. The other thing is dealing with color temperature. The lightest color on the palette is white. That is also the coldest color on the palette. We've got a very warm light source in the form of the kerosene lantern. And so I'm going to try to give the effect of the light by using a warm color. Note how dark this is compared to a white. Now I may put some white in the center, but I'm going to try to use color temperature rather than value to portray the light. If you just keep adding more and more white to trying to lighten something, it just gets chalkier and chalkier and chalkier. And so we're going to do this with value secondary to temperature. One of the ways to create the illusion of light is to light up the area around the light source rather than having a dark come right to the edge of the light. That makes the light not look like light. So I'm kind of creating an area that's going to be very warm to give the effect of that warm light from the candlelight. And I'll start with that. Again, using the edge of my hand. And notice the warm color against the cool board. I'm using ampersand sanded board, by the way, which is a very rigid surface. But that light against the cool board already gives the effect of some light. The subject of this painting is not going to be Mike and Lupe, it's going to be the light and the effect of light on them. Now, one of the things I want to do is just create the positioning. I'm using a pretty dark but pretty warm color, and this for some reason is kind of scratchy. So he's going to be there. Lupe is going to be over here. She is a beautiful model, but she's going to be the secondary source of interest, so I'm not going to put in much detail actually on either of them, but even less on her. And what I'm going to do is grind that in with the heel of my hand to get it into the tooth of the board. The oils from my hand cause me a big problem. As I go through this process, every time we take a break, I go and wash my hands to remove the oils. For you ladies who want nice, soft, velvety skin, this is probably not the most fun thing for your skin because you're taking all the oil out of your skin. But if I get oil on here with the pastel, it's going to start to create wet areas and it's going to lift some of the pastel off the surface. I'm putting a very thin layer on here. There's hardly any pastel on, unlike oil where you can just put down juicy brush strokes, just loaded with pigment. Here, this ends up being pretty thin layers. And so the oil can create a problem. And it's one of the things I sort of have to fight with a bit. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to use some charcoal just to get the positioning right. As you all know, drawing is measuring. It's not so much about flamboyant, loose, expressive strokes. It's really just getting the right part in the right place. And so that's what I'm going to work on here. And I can see right now, I'm going to make this a little larger, this area. What I'm doing is trying to get sort of a base tone that's going to represent his skin in the light and her skin in the light. And then a lot of this painting is going to be about what's around it. I'm going to come back in on top of this with cooler colors for the shadows. And with light, as you all know, generally if you have warm light, you're going to have cool shadows. If you have cool light, you're going to have warm shadows. This light is even warmer than an incandescent bulb. I mean, this is a candle light, sort of a light source, very yellow and red, and so very hot light reflecting on the two models. Mike is about from base of his hat to the bottom of his beard is about equidistant to that flame. So I want to make sure that I think I may move that flame down a bit. Have it almost coming off of this. And when I rub this in with the heel of my hand, it goes into the tooth of the board. If I want to get rid of it, I use light strokes from a paper towel and takes it off. So if you remember the Karate Kid, wax on, wax off. In this case, pastel on, pastel off. I'm getting some strange grittiness here. I'm not quite sure what that's from, but okay, I'm going to use a lighter yellow just to kind of indicate where that flame is. Maybe a softer pastel. Normally you want to be pretty light in applying the pastel to the surface, because if it gets too deep and cakes up too much, then it won't accept any more pastel and you're dead in the water. Okay. Back to measuring. So if this is the base of his beard, his hat is going to be right here. And the width of his head is about equal to the distance from the base of his beard to the base of his hat. And it's a little bit, from my vantage point, a little bit to the left of the light source, so like right about here. So from there to there is about where he is. Even as I'm doing this early phase, I'm squinting to simplify shapes and values. You might say, why would you squint? To compare values when you're just trying to get placement. I find that it helps to get going correctly right from the beginning. Okay.
Push that around, it looks like you don't care that it's outside the limits of the head.
I don't care that it's outside the limits of the head. I'm not creating a line and painting up to the line. Normally, you want to go across the form and into the background. You want to connect everything. We're all connected in this world, including your figure and your ground. And so at this phase, I'm not careful about that at all. And in fact, if you draw a very tight outline and then paint up to the edges of it, you're going to have a very flat looking piece of work when you're done. It's going to be like, paint by numbers or something. So you want to paint across the form. Now, the distance between their heads is about equal to the width of Mike's head. So again, I've got to move this over a bit. I'm not going to move it over quite as much as the reality here. Because what I'm trying to do with this piece is create an effect much more than creating a tight rendering of what I see here. So I want to get that effect. And if the placement is off a little bit, that doesn't bother me. Normally, when you're working, if you figure out what you're trying to do first, that's a good starting point. Because to paint light or to paint shadow, you can make one or the other the most important, but you can't make both equally important at the same time. And if you're trying to create a lighting effect, which is really what this piece is going to be about, I can't simultaneously be concerned with creating the lighting effect and with doing a tight rendering, certainly not even relatively tight compared to just creating the effect, and definitely not so tight as to be a portrait. And so this will, in all likelihood, not look much like either of them, but it will hopefully give the effect of our models in this wonderful warm light shed by the candle. So now this is sort of giving the effect of warm light and cool background, but the value here is way too light. That background is just, it's not black, but it's definitely much, much darker than they are. So I'm going to put a lupe in right about here to here. Top of her head is about here. The height of her head a little bit higher than the distance between the end of his beard and his hat. His hat's going to be up here someplace. So her chin will be right about there. Now what I really need to do is get a lot of the background in. Both of you are doing a super job, by the way, of holding just steady as a rock. In here someplace. What I'm measuring is how far down his hand is, because his hand is going to be that warm color as well. One of the nice things about these ampersand boards is you can paint all the way to the edge, just as if it were a canvas, except for the fact that my dust trough is down below here. And by the way, I use this dust trough because it is infinitely better to tap your surface and let the pastel dust fall down and catch it in the trough rather than blowing it and shooting it off into the air so it catches in your lungs. They tell us this stuff won't give us cancer, but they used to say that about cigarettes too. So when I was a kid, I learned that 7 out of 8 doctors preferred Lucky Strikes. So, now the darkest dark, what is the darkest dark? I've got my light source. And I think that the darkest area that I see up there, there's actually a couple of them. One, it's the back of my shoulder. And the other is an area on the top of Lupe's head. What I'm going to do is get rid of some of this, because if I try to put the black right on top here, it's going to start mixing with that red color, so I'm going to try to get rid of that. Normally, if you make like a little chisel, a little point with your paper towel, you can dislodge that pastel dust from the surface. So what I want to do is clean it off a bit. And really going down into here for her hair. I'm going to do a half an hour of video on cleaning off pastel from the surface. Just kidding. Okay. Close enough for rock and roll. And that's just going to kind of go into the background. With this piece, since I'm so concerned with capturing the lighting effect, I'm going to kind of ignore some of the normal hierarchy. And if you think about the way we artists learn. The first thing we struggle with is getting the shapes right. So shapes or drawing. Secondly, we try to get the values, the relative light or dark. And then after that comes color temperature. And then finally edges. And of course, it's all tied together with design. So those are the 5 elements. That's really all you need to create a decent painting. There's something a little more metaphysical that goes beyond that, and that is, why are you painting the subject in the first place? But if you get those 5 elements, you've learned pretty much all you need to do to be able to create the illusion of 3-dimensional reality on a 2-dimensional surface. So we could all go home and make beautiful masterpieces right now. That was the secret. But because I'm so concerned with the lighting effect, I'm not so concerned about the drawing, getting everything exactly accurate. Most of the edges in here are going to be lost edges, just kind of bleed into the background. I'm very concerned with color temperature. And so we're going to have the warm light and other things being kind of cool. And the values are also going to be important. That's the darkest dark, but this background right behind is almost as dark as that black. Now I can grind that black in to get it into the tooth of the paper, or in this case, the board. But my hands are getting pretty ground down. I've been doing this for a couple of days on sanded surfaces. So I'm going to use another technique. I've got some denatured alcohol, and I'm going to use that to dissolve the pastel. I don't want to make it too runny because it'll just start to run down the surface. But that turns it into something kind of like watercolor, and that will go in as well. That's another way.
What kind of brush are you using?
It's a soft one. It's a good question. I don't know the brand.
Is it Sable?
Yeah, I think it's a Sable. Softer is better for this purpose because it's like we're creating watercolor. And this is going to get it into the surface. The alcohol will evaporate pretty quickly, and then it gets kind of grayed. But when I come back over that again with a dark when it's dried, then it's going to have a very deep dark. With pastels, the struggle is always to get the darks deep enough. Now, I mentioned that the background is almost as dark as the darkest dark in here. One of the things I want to do in the beginning is establish my darkest dark on the surface, the lightest light, the purest color, and the sharpest edge. If I know those 4 extremes, then I can have something to compare to. The lightest light is clearly the light source. The darkest dark we talked about. There are not really a whole lot of sharp edges, but when I squint way down, and I squint to compare, as I squint so much that everything almost vanishes, the sharpest edge is actually the edge on Mike's hat. So I want to establish that. So I'm going to do a little bit of drawing and kind of measure that. In the front edge of the hat. Well, first of all, I think I'll establish where the base of his nose is. Because the base of the nose is about half the distance from the lower base of the hat to the bottom of his beard. This is going to be my center line. I'm using charcoal because the charcoal will just kind of dissolve into the pastel. If I used a particular color of pastel, then I'd be dealing with that, particularly as I blended. And the charcoal doesn't give me that issue. But the base, or the bottom of his nose, is going to be about midway down. And I need that because the brim of the hat goes out about 3/4 of the distance from the bottom of the beard to the base of the nose. And so the brim of his hat is going to be out here someplace. And it kind of angles. I'm using this brush as a measuring device. And one of the things I learned from Bill Parks, my old life drawing teacher, who was a wonderful, wonderful teacher. He was also Dan Gerhardt's teacher, Scott Burdick's teacher, Sue Lyon's teacher, Ramel Delatorre's teacher. He's taught a lot of successful artists in his day. But one of the things that I learned from Bill Parks is you can think of the hands on a clock. So if this was the hour hand on a clock, this is midnight. There's 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock, 5, 6, and so on. If you think of the hands on the clock to get an angle, this is about 10:30. And so I know that the edge of that hat goes at an angle about like that. So about 1/3 of the distance from base of nose to chin. 1, 2, 3 is the distance to the center of that hat. And the lowest point on his hat is actually out here somewhere. So this brim starts to angle up right about at the same point as the middle. And the widest point on the brim is actually a little bit short of the distance out here. So the widest point is out here someplace. And the intersection with the head is like right here. One of the things I'm doing as I measure is making straight lines rather than trying to do a curve. One of the best things I ever learned is see how square you can make the round. It's another Bill Parksism. If you're a surveyor and you're trying to make a curve in a road, the surveyors don't go like that. What they do is they send somebody out with one of those sticks and they shoot it through a whatever that thing is, a sextant. I don't think it's a sextant, but whatever it is, and they make a straight line, and then they have the person with the pole move, and then they make another straight line, then another straight line. So it's a series of straight lines to create the curve. If we do that in our drawing, our drawings end up being much more powerful. And I said I wasn't going to spend a lot of time on the drawing, and here I am. The highest point on that brim is up to about there. And the only reason I'm doing this on that hat brim is because that is the sharpest edge. Another thing that Mr. Park said, which is a helpful tool, is to remember that hats are built to go on heads, which means you have to think of the head underneath that hat. One of the mistakes that I used to make when I started out, and that I see a lot of students make, is they'll do a very nicely rendered hat that is too small for whatever skull would be underneath. So hats are built to fit on heads. By the way, Lupe, don't kill your arm. You can put your arm down for a minute because I'm mostly working on your uncle. So one has to suffer for art, and I've always been a great believer that the model should suffer more than the artist, but we don't want them to suffer unnecessarily. Okay. And it's actually out here in the corner a little more. Okay, one of the things I'm going to try to do now is get a little more of the background color in. And the background here is almost as dark as that darkest dark, which now that it's evaporated, I'm going to come back in and put some more black on top. And you'll see how dense that gets. I said I'm not going to blow, but I don't want to get that black going into my candle here. Okay, so the background is almost that dark, but not quite, and it's darker back here if I squint. Squinting and comparing. So I'm going to take a color, actually kind of a dark green. And see how it's taken about an eighth of this pastel off just with those few strokes. The sanded board is wonderful, but it eats up the pastels. It's kind of a lighter color behind her. And I'm really dealing more with value here. And it's a little bit lighter right. And gets a little lighter over here. Not going to have any pastels left by the time I get done with this background. Look at that. That took half the pastel. And
Are you going to blend those two colors?
I am, but instead of blending with my hand too much, I'm going to use my denatured alcohol. Here's sort of an intermediary, a little bit of a warm. What I'm going to try to do is get all of these values down. Now, his hat is lighter than his skin, and that's actually the lightest light other than the light source. So I've got it. I'm very concerned with the keying of this piece, because if I get things too light, they're not going to read the right way. That has to remain the light source. So I need something that's darker than that and cooler than that for the white of his hat brim. And we'll see. That might do. I said cooler. It's actually a fairly warm color. I'll be traveling light when I go home, because all my pastels are going to be eaten up by these sanded boards. Okay, this part of it I'm going to grind in with my hand.
That surface about like a Kitty Wallace surface?
Like a Kitty Wallace surface? No, it's not quite as abrasive. I love the Wallace sanded paper, and you're painting on sandpaper. And so it eats up the pastel and it eats up your fingers, but it is a great surface for holding pastel. This is not quite as abrasive. And the main advantage of the ampersand, from my point of view, is that I have something that is rigid, and it's a board, and so I can do things both in terms of the application and the framing, particularly the framing. I can put this under glass with the same kind of frames that I use in my oil paintings, and it's a much different effect than having a matted surface that you see typically with pastels. And I like that effect. Now, back up under here, which is deep into the shadow, and you can't probably really see that, there is kind of some important things happening. I'm going to move this and hope that everything doesn't fall over. Just for the moment. Because what I need to do is get this area and get this cool of the top of his hat, which is cooler and lighter. So I'll try. I might have to come over that again with a darker color, but maybe I can just do it with temperature. Maybe a little bit darker than that, where it goes back in. Yeah. Back darker throughout. Okay. I'll wedge it back under here so that it holds my board in place. Okay, let's see what I got here. Starting to give the effect. I want to get some warmer darks. That's not dark enough. See, a lot of times I can't tell. I think that's the same color. I can't tell until I put something on the surface. So maybe I have to use this. I may have to run out to an art supply store and buy some black here. There is an edge for his far arm. And I'm dealing with these issues of key. This painting is really about color, temperature, and key to create the effect of that light.
What is key?
Key is, if you think of a 10-value scale, if you went from black at the darkest to pure white at the lightest and used all of the values in between, you'd have a full spectrum painting. You could also have a painting like in this case where my lightest value is nowhere close to white. My lightest value is going to be much darker than that. And so I'm keying the whole thing down towards the dark end of the spectrum. Often the most powerful paintings have a very limited value range. Instead of using a 1 to a 10 value, it might go 1 to 6. Or maybe it's 10 to 4. And so by compressing the value range and limiting the values, often it makes for an interesting and more expressive painting. A lot of the Impressionists used very high-keyed paintings. If you look at the darkest dark in most of Monet's work, or Sicily or some of those people, their darkest dark is 3 or 4 values lighter than black. And in fact, if you take Impressionist paintings out of the frames, they look pretty anemic. It's the frame that creates the darkest dark in many cases. And it's interesting, they were so concerned with color, temperature, and temperature relationships that they didn't pay too much attention to value, and they certainly didn't pay attention to drawing. Which is why if you take a lot of the Impressionist works and desaturate them, put them in Photoshop and take all the color out and turn them into black and white and shades of gray, they look extremely weak because they were not concerned with value, they were concerned with temperature. And a lot of their lighting effects were temperature effects. There's a lot of great artists. Morgan Weisling tends to have a very dark-keyed palette when he approaches a lot of his paintings, and it creates this very moody, mystical kind of feeling. If he had the full range from black to white, you'd lose a lot of that. And so that's what I mean by key. This is going to be a very low-keyed painting. Excluding that light source, the range is going to go from black to something that's maybe 4 values away from it. I've got all of these nice light colors. I'm not going to use any of them in this painting. And in fact, one of the challenges that I'm going to face is that I have very few darks to work with, and so I'm going to have to work with you know, if you look at this value, which I'm using for the areas where the light is hitting their faces, and compare that to, you know, something like this, this is not usable. So I've got all of these colors in here that I can't use for today. I'm going to get my denatured alcohol out. And I've learned to make sure that I don't get big splotches of the denatured alcohol running down through the middle of something I don't want. See how that puts it right into the tooth of the board?
Would you be able to use this on paper?
You can. I could do this on this board with water, because the water would do the same thing. It would dissolve the pastel. It wouldn't evaporate as quickly as the alcohol does. If you do alcohol on paper, it won't wrinkle the paper. If you do water, it'll wrinkle it, just like watercolor paper ends up getting wrinkled from the water unless you stretch it first.
Would water wrinkle this board?
Nope. And so I could use water, but I like the evaporation speed of the alcohol. And see, I can, now some of the colors on here. Pastel pigment is the exact same pigment that's in oil paint. It's just that instead of being bound together with oil for a binder, it's really held together. They roll this, they make a paste out of water with a little bit of gum arabic in it. I'm kind of painting this background. Again, just to get it into the surface of the paper, just because it's faster than grinding it in, and it's going to create more of a base. If I was doing this, another way to approach this would have been to buy some Canson paper that was tinted a very dark color. You can do that. And then painted the warm colors for the lights on the paper. I could have done it in a lot less time, but I happen not to have that particular shade with me, so that's why we're doing this. Again, Lupe, you don't need to have your hand up there for this purpose. I'm just painting background.
Does the boards, the ampersand boards, come in different dark colors?
No, they come in that kind of greenish tone. I think they come in a greenish tone, a grayish tone, and a white or cream color, if memory serves me. They may expand that. They should expand it. Maybe I'll give them a call.
Would this pastel be hard to remove after you put it on with the alcohol?
Yes. That's why you want to do it. I'm doing this after I know pretty much where these things are going to be, particularly the darkest dark, because that's I could probably abrade it off, but it would be difficult. And so I'm not going to be doing a lot of moving of things in this painting once they're on here with the alcohol.
Is it difficult to apply another pastel color on top of this?
No, it goes right on top. This This is almost like I'm toning the board. It'll become very easy.
Well, that was Inner Flame Pastel with William A. Schneider, and you can learn more about the full-length video. It's one of our classics at lilyartvideo.com. Remember, we have a special discount code for today only, and it's in the comments section. Well, thanks for watching today. I want to remind you that we have a free video. It's called 97 Amazing Painting Secrets from the World's Best Artists, and you can get it for free at 97tips.com. I'm Eric Rhodes. Thank you for watching.